this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan. Any occasion to gauge your mind is a thrill for me. The last time we spoke was just over a year ago. In the middle of the protests, it's the first weeks of the October 17 uprising and all the momentum. And I gave you a call from Beirut to sort of seek wisdom on American foreign policy while everything was happening. And you were very generous back then. And a year later, I feel like there's more to talk about. The story keeps...
There's always more to talk about.
There's always more to talk about. And this time
that's
around...
That's one of the few blessings of the Middle East, I guess.
You're absolutely right. The story keeps evolving, for better or worse.
Yeah.
And I think I had the advantage of doing only audio episodes when I first started. Now I've sort of upgraded to video. And before we started recording, we kind of examined each other's wrinkles here and there, and
now you have to look at this. I'm very sorry for you and the audience, but yes.
We've aged quite a bit since the ACS days. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Firas, I want to start really with just maybe the broad story, a very broad story of the election, the outcome, Biden administration, and I mean just the general hesitation and perhaps anxiety that you hear among all types, policy makers and sort of the pundits, that there's going to be a change towards not just Lebanon, but the region. And a lot of this has to do with American engagement with Iran and sort of policies in confronting Iran. And I just want to get your initial opinion on whether or not you see fundamental changes happening. And there's a piece that sort of lays this out in a way. It's from the National. It's for the Middle East. Biden is no Obama. And that title is sort of striking, that in a sense, we're not going back to the way things were 4 years ago and more, that we're actually going back to the usual sort of routine policy, that the way America interacts with the Middle East, with somebody who's been on the scene for many, many years. And that's Joe Biden. So let's just start there. Maybe we can start actually with what you see as potential differences and what you see as sort of consistencies, and we can go from there, from Lebanon towards the region.
Thank you, Ronnie, and it's always a pleasure to be back on this podcast and to reconnect. I'm sure we're going to enjoy this because we are old friends and we have similar passions when it comes to the Middle East. I hope the audience enjoys it too. Listen, the initial idea for this op-ed that you referenced that was published, Biden is no Obama in the Middle East, came just through the experience of my commentary during the U.S. elections, and I was invited to speak on a lot of pan-Arab TV stations, and I couldn't help but notice the level of anxiety on the other side of that camera. People, particularly in the Gulf, but not exclusively in the Gulf, I know that that sense of anxiety is shared in many quarters in Lebanon. They seem to think that a Trump defeat and a return of the Democrats to the White House will inevitably lead us back to Obama cozying up to the Iranians, and essentially what is viewed in the region, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, as a pact that was done at their expense. And I thought that was surely exaggerated. And I still do think that it is exaggerated for several reasons. I lay out the case that when it comes to personality, but also when it comes to policy, but let's start with personality. When it comes to personality, Biden is no Obama. I mean, this is somebody who was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1973. So do the math; it was never my strong suit, but nearing on 50 years ago, maybe.
Before the Lebanese Civil War, pre-Civil
before
War.
the Lebanese Civil War. I mean,
That's some time ago.
This is your classic professional politician, and much of those years were actually spent on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So this is a person who knows the world real well, enjoys and is passionate about foreign policy, as many of us are, has traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, has no love lost for the Iranians. And actually, in a break with sort of what has come to, in many ways, to define the Democratic Party in the minds of many outsiders, the progressive left, right? The Bernie Sanders of the Democratic Party and some of the others there. He's not an isolationist. He's not somebody who wants to just, we've had it with the Middle East. We've got to focus on rebuilding at home. He's not that guy. He voted for the Iraq War. I found it very interesting when I was doing research for the piece that after voting for the Iraq War in 2003, in 2004, on a trip to Iraq from Fallujah, he called for more troops. He wanted to send more U.S. troops. He wanted to double down on Iraq. Same thing in the 90s when Clinton was in the White House. He was very much an advocate of intervening in Bosnia in favor of the Bosnian Muslims and to ending the slaughter. So he has a liberal interventionist impulse. So this is not Obama. And again, to talk about the personality, Obama is the almost mirror opposite of that. He is the outsider, the relative young newcomer who was not well known in Washington, was elected to the Senate, and basically swept into Washington on a promise of change, of drastic change and ending forever wars, coming after the George W. Bush era and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So these are two very different people with very different experiences. And on policy, particularly to take it back to Iran and the JCPOA, one just has to look at, again, the track record and what Biden has said when he put pen to paper. There are at least two op-eds out there that Biden has penned in the past year. One in Foreign Affairs, I believe it was March or April in the spring of 2020, and another one for CNN, September of 2020. And in both of them, he basically spells out that returning to the nuclear deal, which is, yes, a differentiating factor between Trump on one hand and Biden on the other. We could talk about these points of differences, but that the nuclear deal will be the starting point, not the end point and the end objective in his engagement with Iran, and that he will push to stretch out or to push out some of these controversial sunset clauses, essentially when Iran can then begin to enrich to higher levels again, that he will tackle the problematic ballistic missile issue around development and testing of long-range ballistic missiles, and that he will work with U.S. allies in the region, so, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some of the others involved there. He will work with them to deal with some of the problematic destabilizing regional activities that Iran's engaged in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in other places. So, I mean, this doesn't sound like Obama to me. Obama essentially went behind the backs of his Arab allies. He started secret negotiations through the Omani Channel, and it caught the Saudis and the Emiratis and others by surprise, and referred to his Middle Eastern allies as free riders that need to do more. There was not much warmth and love lost between Obama and many of his allies in the Middle East. I don't see Biden going down that route, although, yes, he will try to go back and engage with the Iranians, get the nuclear deal back on the table, and he will also focus very much on trying to end the Yemen war. That has been clearly a focal of his talking points when it comes to the Middle East. So there will be changes. I'm not there arguing that there won't be, but it wasn't anything near what I was hearing from the other end of the line or the other side of the camera in all these interactions, that level of anxiety in the Middle East that, oh my God, we're going back to Obama all over again.
I'm glad that you're mentioning the sort of the anxiety and maybe the almost the psychological component under the Obama administration and sort of regional players and how they perceived American policy, and also that secretive nature that you just referenced. Is that where the concern comes from, that it was American maneuvering without consultations? But otherwise, it's sort of it's a consistent approach in that the Americans are moving on from their older conflict with Iran, whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump, or whether it's Biden, that there is going to have to be some negotiation with Iran. And that the Obama position was more America alone, and then the region follows American policy rather than a multilateral approach.
I do believe that Obama was an outlier at that point in time. And I referenced in that article in particular some of his close confidants and advisors. Ben Rhodes is one of them, just in the sense that, both Obama's an outsider and Ben Rhodes also not somebody who has a terribly long foreign policy experience, but yet nonetheless was at the center of things when Obama was in the White House. They upended what used to be a bipartisan consensus in relation to rogue regimes like Iran and Cuba. I mean, we kind of forget the Cuba leg of this and aspect of this, but the Obama administration did a 180 on traditional U.S. foreign policy in Cuba. And just as an aside, the Democrats paid dearly for it in this election because Cuban Americans did not like that deal and voted against the Democratic Party in a crucial swing state like Florida. So it's yet to be seen whether the Democrats under a Biden administration would go back to their understanding with Cuba, given the domestic cost that now entails for Democrats. But they did that with Iran and they did that with Cuba, and it was perceived and pitched as part of Obama's legacy of doing things differently. Now, that doesn't mean that things haven't shifted and then the needle hasn't moved as it relates to the Democratic Party and its approach to the Middle East. Yes, I think a lot has changed. There is, Saudi Arabia in particular, but also the UAE to some extent. The way that they're viewed in Washington has not been terribly positive. It has had some difficulties in the past couple of years, particularly in the left of center with the Democratic Party. So there are concerns, and much of that is fueled by the war in Yemen. And this was kind of why Biden will have to address the war in Yemen. But there are also constants when it comes to the U.S. approach to the Middle East. There are interests that the U.S. simply cannot detach itself from and forget about, despite what the political rhetoric in Washington might be, right? I mean, wars are not popular. They have especially not been popular since George W. Bush. Yeah. And so one of the great consistencies between Obama and Trump is the slogan of ending forever wars. And, we are in Washington today and there's already talk about Trump wanting to withdraw from Afghanistan and Iraq before Inauguration Day, before his term is over. And he's doing that with his political future in mind, because he's thinking about either a 2024 run or at least being the kingmaker in any future run or any future Republican candidate for the presidency. So he's playing to the street again. He's playing to the base. And so these things are constant in terms of, Middle Eastern involvement in Middle Eastern wars are not popular in the U.S. But nonetheless, look at where the Middle East is. The Middle East sits there on the map. Geopolitics does not lie. It sits there in between three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is home to some 50+% of proven global oil reserves. It's got one of America's leading allies, which actually does resonate domestically here in Washington and has a lot of influence, which is obviously Israel. Often the Middle East does not leave you alone. Even if you do want to leave it alone, it comes knocking because of issues relating to radical Islam. So there are plenty of issues that will, and then finally, and I know we will talk about that at some point, the growing or the rise of great power competition, the fact that this crucial part of the world right now increasingly is experiencing the return of Russia into the scene, and also the rise of China. And we know that these are things that are also important from a U.S. perspective and from U.S. national interest. So, in no shape or form do you look at the Middle East from Washington D.C. and think this is a place where the Democrats, a Biden administration, is all of a sudden going to unplug or care less, or you know what, just cut the deal with the Iranians again and tell America's Arab allies, sort of, good luck, you're on your own. It's not. I don't think it's going to be that.
How does personality factor in with at least the Trump administration? And I'm curious about the last policies as this administration goes. Several weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, Gibran Bassil was sanctioned in Lebanon. I think it was today or maybe last night that there was this report about Donald Trump himself curious about bombing Iranian nuclear facilities, and sort of his staff intervenes. I think Pompeo is one of these sort of voices that sort of says no. And there's this eagerness to intervene more under the Trump administration. Is that born out of personality, really? That there's this, rather than policy, that Donald Trump he himself wants to have a lasting influence in the region, that we don't usually see that kind of deep curiosity or even concern among other presidents. Case in point, Obama, I don't think had any curiosity in sort of intervening. So what can we touch on personality before we jump into the region and sort of the vacuum and Russia and China?
Personality, Ronnie, is a fascinating area when it comes to geopolitics and foreign affairs, and there are people who are much more capable than I am who have written books about that. But I have read some of these books, and I do find it interesting. And I also have the benefit of being in Washington too. So a lot of the folks who go in and out of these administrations are people that we know, and we grab meals and drinks with, and so we hear the anecdotal stories and we see the impact of personalities on policy making. Right? We sort of have a window view into sort of the policymaking machine in Washington. And let me take you back to 4 years ago when Trump was elected. And I remember that one of those conversations, one of the more heated conversations over dinner and drinks that I was involved in Washington, revolved about what the election of Donald Trump will mean for the Middle East. And you had a contingent which argued, and I think with some merit, that listen, if anybody's concerned about undoing some of the damage that Obama did, Donald Trump is the perfect opportunity to do that, because he is not particularly interested or does not have depth in the Middle East. Yet so many of the people who want to be tough on Iran are going to be staffing the administration. So how could you not support Donald Trump?
Right.
And the other side of the argument, dare I say that the side of the argument that I was representing, or I was part of at least, basically was making the case that, yes, I mean, a lot of the people that we do know who want to be tougher on Iran, who understand the Iranian challenge in the region, the way it undermines stability, it undercuts development and progress, that feeds off failed states like Iraq and Yemen, and in many ways Lebanon. Yes, they will be in positions of prominence in policymaking, but the person calling the shots at the end of the day, who makes the decision in the White House, in the Oval Office, can be unstable and unpredictable. And that should be a point of concern for all of us. And I can tell you, just in the 4 years since Donald Trump was elected into the office, the number of stories that have emerged on issues like Syria, but not exclusively about Syria, when the professional cadre of foreign service officers or even political appointees who know the issues, who've been working the policy and trying to implement it, are all of a sudden, after a phone call with President Erdogan, between President Trump and folks from the region, are completely sidetracked by something that the president that had decided on a whim, like we're going to withdraw the troops from Syria. Well, then the bureaucracy pushes back, and 6 months down the road, we still have troops in Syria. And then Trump wakes up on the political necessity of actually making some noise about withdrawing from the Middle East again. And so yet another soundbite, we're going to withdraw from Syria. And today, again, we're witnessing other iterations of that when it comes to pulling out of Afghanistan and Iraq. So, I mean, this is the Donald Trump personality, and it has an impact, a very real impact, to state the obvious, on the policy and disrupting the policy-making process by the professional bureaucracy over the past 4 years. Now, fast forward to Biden, because we want to look forward, not just look backward at sort of what's happened over the past 4 years. We are having similar arguments here in Washington about folks who are like, yeah, but you know what? The Democrats have some troubling potential appointees that will be coming along and be, they will be assistant secretaries of foreign affairs, or on the National Security Council, or senior advisors, secretaries of state, perhaps, who have a checkered record in terms of being tough on Iran and being and understanding the importance of a more forward-leaning U.S. position in the Middle East and what the Middle East means for U.S. interests. My counter argument for that, or to that, is that yes, certainly we will have to wait and see who gets what appointments in the coming administration, and that these personalities will have a significant impact on what the policy ends up being and how it will be implemented and carried out. But let's not at all discount that Biden will be in many ways a foreign policy president. Yes, the domestic priorities and taking on the COVID challenge and rebuilding the American economy, I mean, those all are going to be left, right, and center for him. But we know where the man's passion is, and we know where his track record has been, and we know that he is very much interested in foreign policy and the Middle East. So I really think that in terms of trying to project what a Biden presidency would look like in terms of the Middle East, I think you cannot discount the important role that he will personally play in trying to shape that policy, because I really think that that's where his heart and passion is. That's where it's been, at least.
It's taking me back to Paul Wolfowitz. I think it was Paul Wolfowitz who said constructive destabilization of the Middle East is his wider policy. And then you have these very unique personalities in the White House, Obama and Trump. And now we're going back to something that's familiar, but it sounds more and more like constructive stabilization rather than sort of an erratic policy that, in a way you said earlier, kind of defines the Trump era, that's sort of on a whim. And out of that, sometimes good things happen, but you can't sort of count on them to sort of form a policy per se. Let's go to the region. And I'd like to reference a piece you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "The Arab World Needs American Support," which came out in July, this summer. Let's talk about the vacuum and whether or not there is a vacuum. Because I understood from your other piece that it doesn't really, this hesitation, this sort of anxiety doesn't mean that America has disengaged, that America is still the main player in the region, whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump, or whether it's Biden. Can you maybe touch on whether or not Russia and China are genuine competitors when it comes to American interests in the region, and whether or not there is a sincere reluctance or withdrawal? All I hear is that America is leaving. Started under Obama, and Trump sort of has, in a way, carried through. The exception is Iran's sort of American policy with Iran. Otherwise, disengagement. Is that accurate? And we can go from there, and whether or not Lebanon has anything sort of to gain or lose in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will get to talking about Lebanon and all the parochial Lebanese politics that's involved. We all share this, right? I mean, you turn on the evening news, or you tune into the evening news in Lebanon, and it's literally the same story day in, day out. They are going to form a government. They are not going to form a government. They're a bit closer today. No, they're inching back, and it's not going well. But we all care about Lebanon at an emotional level, and so we definitely do want to talk about Lebanon. But let's go broader first before we go smaller. Yes, so much of the conversation is about the Middle East is framed around Iran and the various dynamics that the competition or the rivalry with Iran spawns throughout the region in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, and other places. But it's important for us to sort of cast a wider net or take a different lens, particularly from a Washington perspective. Iran is part of the regional dynamic, but there's a broader global dynamic, right? And the national security assessment, the latest of which we have here in the US, views the rise of China and the return of Russia as the primary challenge, the strategic, the national security threat that the US will face in the coming decades, right? So it is then fully understandable that from the viewpoint, from the lens of an American policymaker, this will be sort of the outer perimeter, the defining structure through which you view your approach to the world. So it's the great power competition that's taking place. And then you kind of overlay on that Iran and some other regional dynamics there with Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf and the Israelis and whatnot. But the broader picture involves the rise of China and the return of Russia. And when it comes to the Middle East, I mean, it is almost palpable. I mean, we know that Kissinger in the 70s, and particularly with Anwar Sadat, I mean, it's another example of that, right? I mean, if you're sitting in the region, you were looking at the Israeli-Egyptian peace deal through the prism of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Right.
But Kissinger, sitting in Washington, was looking at it from a completely different prism. He was looking at it in terms of the Cold War and competition with the Soviet Union and how to peel away Egypt from the Soviet orbit and bring it into America's orbit. And that kind of was the thinking behind the peace deal that Kissinger had helped engineer between Egypt and the Israelis. So in similar fashion, American policymakers are looking at the region today, and yes, it involves Iran and Turkey and all these, in terms of the return of Russia, which since Kissinger was able essentially to push Russia out in the 70s, began and returned in 2015 when they made, September of 2015 when Russia made its intervention in Syria. I mean, this was in many ways the pivotal moment where Russia came back to the Middle East. But since then, Putin has been very successful in kind of leveraging that operation, that ongoing Russian military mission in Syria, to also get involved in Libya and lead off American failures in Libya. And I was in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh last year when Putin was making his state visit, and I saw the lavish welcome that both of them gave to President Putin, and all the buildings that were lit up in the colors of the Russian flag. And obviously everybody, including Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, America's lead ally in the region, are taking Russia more seriously. Bibi's been to Moscow more than he's been to Washington, D.C. I mean, that should get alarm bells ringing in Washington. So yes, I mean, this is a long sort of response to tell you that the rise of Russia and the return of Russia to the Middle East and the rise of China. China today is the lead trading partner for most Arab countries, including America's Arab allies. And so in the minds of the sort of the strategic thinkers in Washington, the question is, at what point does China begin, or at what point does China take the decision to weaponize its economic might to become more politically and militarily involved in the Middle East? And that's an open question, but it's one that strategic thinkers and military planners in Washington are talking about. The head of CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, General McKenzie, recently referenced the Middle East, describing it as the Wild West of great power competition because of the greater role that China and Russia are playing in that region. So I think that is going to be central, and that's something that we don't think about often, is sort of when we're living in the region. And I think that leads to the natural question of, okay, so is America going to vacate that strategic space? Is America going to really pick up and leave? And if you're on the receiving end of all the rhetoric coming from American politicians, including the president, well, you think yeah, we better start cutting our deals with the Russians and the Chinese because America keeps saying that it's leaving. It's had it with the Middle East. It's pivoting. Right. It's doing all these things. But I personally take that. My view is that to take that with a grain of salt. There is an element of domestic politics involved in how unpopular the Middle East is in the U.S. I just don't see from a geopolitical perspective, I don't see the U.S. vacating that space anytime soon.
So there's going to be just natural competition in that sense, that you will have competitors, economic competitors, geopolitical competitors, but the American withdrawal has been over-exaggerated in that framework, that they're not giving up quite yet. And for many reasons that concern American interests, they're not able.
We still have about 65 days to the Trump presidency, and anything can happen.
That's true.
I mean, he's already talking about wanting to pull out the troops from Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah.
But if we are judging sort of by traditional standards or traditional U.S. foreign policy and what we know from about an incoming Biden administration, I highly doubt that we're going to see that kind of American withdrawal or pivoting away from the Middle East. I think that the constant will remain. There will be robust diplomatic processes with Iran. There will be negotiations. It's an open question whether these negotiations will go anywhere. I mean, I think this will be a very difficult deal to sell in DC, sell to an American Congress, even if the Democrats do end up controlling the Senate, and that's a big if. It seems like the Senate will remain Republican. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration will have an uphill challenge trying to sell a new deal. And then if you're sitting in Tehran, you're also thinking, well, the first time we cut a deal with the Americans, that didn't last long. Biden's probably a one-term president. Right. There's a good chance that the Republicans could be back in 4 years. Do we really want to go through the process of negotiating a new understanding with the Americans that will probably be out the window in 4 years? It's an open question. And of course, we're probably not going to move very quickly on negotiations with Iran because the Iranians have their presidential elections in June or July of 2021, I believe. So, Biden will not assume the presidency until January. Yeah. Then he's got to get his people through the confirmation process through the Senate, which won't be easy. Then get a policy going. And so you're really not going to have any kind of meaningful engagement with the Iranians probably until the second half of 2021. And you'll have 3 years of Biden presidency left. And so I think that process is not a done deal, not automatic, and the results are far from being guaranteed. Again, more reasons why that level of anxiety in the Middle East about a Biden rapprochement with Iran, I think, is overblown and unwarranted.
It's well said. I haven't thought of it that way, actually. I appreciate that perspective. Let's with the limited time we have left, let's talk about Lebanon. And I know Lebanon is in many ways the center of our emotional story. It may not be the center of anyone else's story. And that includes American curiosity at the moment. Lebanon may be way on the back burner, if not on sort of in a storage unit somewhere. And then at the sort of the parting shots, if you will, it's on the news and sort of referenced earlier, the sanctions against Gibran Basir, the sort of the expectation that there may be another round before Trump departs. And just this administration and its ability to exert maximum pressure on Iran through Lebanon. Does Lebanon have anything to hope for or to maybe be concerned with when it comes to the Biden administration? And I'm specifically talking about U.S. foreign policy towards Lebanon in particular. That includes maybe curiosity in what's left of the protest movement. That includes maybe a bailout, if there is one. That includes Hariri, maybe eventually forming a government. Just the limited worldview of Lebanon when it comes to American concerns. Is there anything that we should expect changing for the better or for the worse?
Well, you're absolutely right in the sense that it is a very limited bandwidth that Lebanon occupies in Washington. And yes, it is viewed as a derivative of sort of the broader approach to Iran. There are tensions in terms of U.S. foreign policy priorities in regards to Lebanon. On one hand, there is this natural need to contain Iran in Lebanon, represented by its flagship proxy group in the region, which is Hezbollah. But also, let's not completely forget that there is sort of a historical animosity between Hezbollah and the U.S. that is independent of Iran, which goes back to the Marine barracks bombings and the kidnappings and whatnot. And policymakers who are involved with the Middle East remember that it's part of sort of like their foundational memories of growing up. They do remember the Marine barracks bombing. They do remember the kidnappings and Hezbollah's involvement in that. So there is this sort of there's this priority or there's this policy of wanting to contain and minimize Hezbollah in Lebanon. But that is often in tension with also another foreign policy priority that the U.S. has in relation to the Levant and Lebanon, which is stability, right? I mean, we've got a civil war in Syria, and one might argue that whether that's stabilized or not in the last couple of years, or whether there's more instability down the road. But there's a lot of trouble. Lebanon is host to millions of refugees, the highest in the world when thought about per capita basis.
Yeah.
And so you want to kind of maintain stability, given also what it means for some of your European allies if there's a new flood of refugees because of Lebanon's financial collapse. And these two priorities are competing, right? And so with the Trump administration or with a Republican approach in general, you hear the voices in Congress from Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and some of the other Republicans there. There's an emphasis on needing to tackle Hezbollah and additional sanctions and designations, and particularly when it comes to Shibran Basid. I mean, he's been on the list for a long time,
right?
And he's on, and then with the advent of with the uprising of the protest movement in 2019, there was then this additional angle that was brought in, which is corruption, systematic corruption, and the Magnitsky ask, and that was very convenient from a U.S. perspective to say, well, you know what? Not only is he aiding and enabling a designated terrorist group by being its primary political cover, giving it legitimacy, and but also in terms of the popular anger on the streets of Lebanon against Shibran Basid. So it was a twofer. It was a no-brainer in many ways, and it had been promised for a long time. And I do think that the Trump administration is currently involved in a process of what we could perhaps call setting the table, right? We're leaving, but we're going to set the table for the next administration before we go. And we're going to put in place sanctions that are going to be very difficult for a Biden administration to undo, whether it's in relation to Iran proper or some of Iran's proxy groups, Hezbollah, Shibran Basid in Lebanon. Possibly, the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization, which would make it very difficult in the future to engage in any kind of peace process in Yemen that involves the Houthis. So there's an element of that that's taking place with Trump. And I wouldn't at all exclude the possibility of further designations and sanctions for as far as Lebanon's involved before the Trump administration leaves. But Basile was the big one. Basile was the one that everybody's waiting for, and folks in Lebanon know better than I do what it means for Basile's much talked about presidential aspiration. I find it very difficult to have a Lebanese president who is designated by the world superpower, by the United States, for his corruption.
But I like that analogy, sort of setting the table. That should there, you can make it very difficult to change whatever the Trump doctrine is and was once the Biden administration enters. So it's almost setting the stage for a potential return down the road where the Republicans win again. This will sort of be this will be available already. And Firas, I want to just wrap it up with your permission. I know that you knew my father, and that you visited him from time to time, and maybe would consult him on things regarding policy and maybe even personal matters, where to live and what school to send your children to. If there's anything that you can sort of share with me, I love these sort of personal reflections, that any moment or any sort of any anecdote, just a memory of him, and whether or not. I mean, I like to keep him alive in any way possible. So any reflection would be great.
Your dad is a big loss. I'm sure the loss doesn't compare. Is a loss for you and the family, obviously, but he's also a loss for many of us. And I have very fond memories of him. I do remember him being my first stop in Beirut on any research trip that I took back home, and it would always start out talking personal. We had so much in common in the sense that he spent a long time in DC. Yes. But he was also very, very much Lebanese, and I'm coming up on 20 years in Washington. Wow. So we would always talk about his time in DC, and yes, we would get to talking about where you're currently living and what's the neighborhood like and how did it change. And your dad always had a piece of advice to give of, well, you know what, you really ought to go about where the good schools are, plan for the kids, and move and ship out to the suburbs. And I felt very strongly against shipping out to the suburbs.
That is true.
But he's aside from the personal, we would quickly get to talking obviously about the politics of things. And he was just a treasure for a young aspiring person like myself back then, maybe in my late 20s or early 30s, to get that kind of a view from an insider who was involved in policymaking in Beirut. And he always made the time. That's how I remember. There was never a trip that I took to Beirut where I called on your dad and he said, you know what, these are pretty busy times. Check in with me later. His door was always open, and he would sit there for hours having coffee and debating the Middle East and debating Lebanon in many ways like you and I are doing right now.
You know, I somehow, for better or worse, that was his passion. And I'm glad that you mentioned this, that, yeah, he would always make time to talk about the things that we've been talking about and sort of everything that impacts Lebanon. He always found that time for friends and colleagues. And I miss those interactions myself quite a bit. It's a thrill to always gauge your mind, Firas. And I know we sort of took more of your time than we initially agreed, but it's a privilege to get to have you on the podcast. And I look forward to catching up with you a year from now when I've deteriorated further and you still look fresh. So I think I'm the one on the decline.
I'm the one with kids, so I will definitely have more gray hairs to share.
Okay, so that's the good news. I need to stop doing the podcast once I have children, because then it's nobody will want to look at this anymore.
or pick up on the hair dye.
Exactly. There you go. That's the secret recipe. You're right. Firas, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ronnie.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. And a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.